Welcome back, dear listener, or perhaps, welcome for the very first time. You've arrived at the fireside of the nighttime historian, where the hour is soft and shadowed, where the stars press close, and where the stories of long ago drift gently between waking and sleep. Before we begin tonight's journey, I invite you, if you'd like, to leave a comment and share where you're listening from. Whether it's the quiet hum of a city apartment, a windswept farmhouse, a dorm room overseas, or somewhere far along the edge of night. It's a quiet joy to know where these old stories still find a home. Tonight we follow the path of a great unraveling. Not a single fall from glory, but a long, slow fading, a twilight stretched across centuries. We travel now into the vast and echoing corridors of the Roman Empire, through golden marble forums and smoke-choked cities, across battlefields, council chambers, and forgotten monasteries. This is not the story of one emperor, nor one war, but of time itself, grinding slowly down a giant too wide to fall in one blow. We'll pass through plague and prophecy, through ambition and exile, through whispers in the Senate and thunder beyond the Rhine. And in that quiet, patient descent, we may come to understand how a civilization so mighty, so enduring, did not end at once, but simply changed. So draw your blanket close, let the weight of the day slip quietly away, and come with me now, through fog-bound fields, ruined villas and silent basilicas, to the final days of empire, and to the long, drifting silence. After Rome, picture a city of 1,000,000 souls, nestled by the bend of the Tiber, white marble colonnades catching the last golden light of the afternoon, banners hanging over triumphal arches, children laughing in courtyards, senators in deep thought beneath painted ceilings, and legions, silent and strong, marching across distant hills. This is Rome at the height of her glory, an empire so vast, so intricate, so profoundly woven into the tapestry of the known world that many believed it eternal, destined to endure beyond the stars. They called it the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a 200-year lull in the chaos of history. But even in those golden years, cracks formed beneath the marble. Cracks no statue could cover. From the scorched edges of Syria to the forests of Germania, distant governors ruled with uncertain loyalty. Armies strained under the weight of defending frontiers that stretched across continents, coinage debased, trust eroded, and behind the facades of law and stone, a slow unraveling began. This is not the tale of a sudden collapse. No single fire consumed Rome in a night. It is a story of attrition, of echoes fading into twilight, of emperors rising and falling like wind-blown leaves, of religion reshaping power, of cities crumbling while others rose anew in their likeness. Some would say, Rome died, others, that it changed its face and lived on in cathedral domes, in carved Latin prayers, in the stones beneath our feet. Tonight we walk through that long, dusky corridor, from gilded palaces to ruined colonnades, through schisms and sackings, martyrs and emperors, mosaics and ashes. And perhaps by the end we'll come to understand not just how the Roman Empire died, but how it never truly left us. It begins with the shimmer of sunlight on marble, with the sound of sandals brushing smooth pavement and the low murmur of the forum beneath the golden afternoon light. Rome, eternal, proud, impossibly vast. By the time of Emperor Trajan, the empire spanned from the misty moors of Britannia to the rich sands of Arabia, from the cool forests of Germania to the fertile fields of Egypt. No city in the world could rival its splendor, its architecture a harmony of triumphal arches, basilicas, aqueducts, and colonnades. The roads stretched like veins through a continent, over 29 great highways fanning out from the capital, each stone laid by hand, each mile marked with Rome's unyielding stamp. The Pax Romana, Rome's long peace, was never truly without war, but it was a time when the machine of empire worked with a steady, thunderous rhythm. Grain poured in from Egypt, wine from Gaul, silk from the east. The Mediterranean, now a Roman lake, carried ships thick with goods and rumour. Senators spoke of stability, of virtues and pietas, even as their power withered in the shadow of the emperor. And yet, to walk the streets of Rome in the 2nd century was to believe, perhaps foolishly, that such a world could last forever. Even the stars seemed to bow to the empire's ambition. The Colosseum roared with life, its gladiators hailed as legends. The Pantheon welcomed all gods beneath one vast dome. In the provinces, cities bloomed in marble imitation, little Romes rising in Hispania, Gaul, Africa and Syria. Latin became the language of law and logic. Roman law governed millions. The imperial cult wove emperors into the fabric of divinity. A farmer in Thrace, a merchant in Carthage, a general in Antioch. All were Romans now, at least in name. But this golden world was already stretched thin. For every mile of road paved, a legion marched farther from Rome. For every coin minted, silver was thinned, value diluted. For every conquered people, a new garrison remained behind. And in the quiet moments, behind the spectacles, behind the orations, whispers stirred, of frontier unrest, of corrupt governors, of borders too wide for one city to rule. Still, in those days, when the moon rose over the Tiber and smoke from the bakeries curled through the alleys, it was easy to believe, easy to think the empire eternal, easy to forget that all golden things, even marble cities, even mighty laws, one day begin to crack. Imagine a parchment map, unfurled by the flickering light of an oil lamp. At its centre, the eternal city, Roma, heart of the known world. And from there, roads like arteries stretch outward into shadow, names inscribed in faded ink. Londinium, Vindobona, Antiochia, Alexandria. Cities hundreds, even thousands of miles apart, bound by a single will, but separated by time, distance and silence. In the days of the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire reached its greatest breadth, over 5 million square kilometers of territory, housing more than 70 million souls. A third of the world's population, governed by one senate, one emperor, one code of law. Yet the very vastness of this empire, once its strength, now trembled at his own weight. A message from the governor of Britannia might take weeks, even months, to reach Rome. By courier, by ship, over snow-cloaked Alps, and through rebel-haunted woods. Decisions made in marble halls arrived too late to matter, and at the edges, along the Rhine, the Danube, the sands of Mesopotamia, those delays could be fatal. Across these distant frontiers stood generals and governors, men who commanded legions, collected taxes, negotiated with local kings, and who over time began to feel less like servants of Rome and more like kings in their own right. In Egypt, in Syria, in Gaul, the governors built palaces, minted local coinage, even styled themselves in imperial dress. Loyalty to the emperor remained, but it was often a matter of convenience, not devotion. Power drifted outward, like ripples on a pond long after the stone had been thrown. Culturally too, the world beyond Rome shifted and shimmered. In the Latin West, Romanization meant aqueducts, Latin grammar, and amphitheatres. But in the Greek East it was different. There, the language of the courts was still Greek, the gods wore older names, and Rome often felt more like a caretaker than a conqueror. In the distant provinces, Roman identity was both a gift and a mask, taken on when needed, forgotten when it wasn't. Beneath the surface of this vast, glittering empire, cracks deepened. The road builders could not smooth the rugged hills of culture. The garrisons could not silence every whisper of rebellion. Along the Danube, Germanic tribes watched, learned, and waited. In Judea, in Gaul, in Britain, unrest stirred like a quiet storm, and though the emperors built walls, Hadrian's in the north, Limes across the east, they could not stop the winds of change. Rome, at its zenith, had become a map without margins. But the more territory it gained, the less it could hold. And somewhere, in the long silence between order given and order obeyed, the empire began to lose its voice. Beneath the marble colonnades of the Roman Forum, time seemed to pause. Pigeons cooed from the broken eaves, sunlight filtered through rising columns, and the statues of old consuls stood like ghosts in the morning haze. The Senate still met here, robed in white, with sandals whispering over stone. But the real power had long drifted elsewhere. Once, the Republic had balanced itself upon a delicate web of orators, assemblies, and the guiding hand of law. Now, beneath the polished surface of order, a new reality settled in, that the emperor, princeps, was the true axis of the world. The Principate, born of Augustus's clever illusions, had outlived the charade. The Senate offered tribute more than governance, and while the laws were still read aloud, their authority came not from debate, but from decree. Philosophers, sensing the change, turned inward. It was in this age that the Stoics flourished, sages who taught not how to govern empires but how to rule oneself. In smoky libraries and shaded porticos, young men studied the writings of Zeno and Epictetus. Among them sat Marcus Aurelius, emperor, soldier, and thinker, who by flickering lamplight would write his meditations, reflecting on duty, death, and the fleeting nature of all things. "Look upon the ceaseless flow of time," he wrote, "and all that is swept away in its current." Even as he fought on the northern frontiers, Marcus wrote of stillness, of patience, of the shortness of life and the futility of pride. But behind his words, beautiful as they were, a truth lingered. The empire he sought to preserve was already bending beneath pressures he could not control. The silver in the denarius was thinning. Grain supplies grew erratic. The Antonine plague, sweeping through cities and legions alike, left fields untended, markets empty, temples quiet. In the streets of Rome, life went on. The baker lit his oven, the merchant opened his stall, gladiators bled for cheers beneath the arches of the Colosseum. But in the Curia Julia, the Senate hall, the voices were fainter now, the orations shorter, the decisions more ceremonial than real. Commodus, Marcus's son and successor, would break the illusion entirely. Where his father had pondered the stars and scribbled virtue in his journal, Commodus swung a wooden sword in the arena and called himself Hercules reborn. He turned away from the philosophers and toward spectacle, and in doing so, he brought the curtain down on the age of the 5 good emperors. The Forum remained, but the whispers inside it carried less meaning, and the statues, weathered by years and soot, seemed to listen more than the men who walked beneath them. It was subtle at first, a shiver in the grain supply, a missing tribute from a distant province, a column of smoke on the horizon where there should have been peace. Rome still called it peace, Pax Romana, but the silence was beginning to break. The Antonine plague, likely smallpox or measles, swept through the empire sometime around 165 CE. Brought back by legions returning from the east, it moved faster than orders could be sent, faster than prayers could be spoken. In city after city the baths grew quiet, the temples full of incense and grief. Some accounts say the plague claimed 5 million lives. Others say it took more. The streets of Rome, once humming with life, began to echo with funerary chants and the creak of makeshift pyres. The empire staggered. Labour became scarce. Farms went untended. Tax bases shrank. Legions too were struck. Soldiers coughing in their tents. Commanders praying to forgotten gods. And beyond the Rhine and Danube, the Germanic tribes watched, waited, and pressed closer. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, names like thunderclouds, began to test the borders. They crossed rivers in the night, struck with sudden fury, and vanished again. Towns were burned, forts overrun. Marcus Aurelius, philosopher king, was forced to spend much of his reign in military camps, dictating letters by firelight while steel clashed beyond the walls. Even after his victories, hard-won and incomplete, the damage was done. The Danube frontier would never feel truly safe again. And when Marcus died in 180 CE, the empire lost not only a thinker, but its last anchor to the old ideal, the Stoic ideal, the quiet strength of reason and restraint. His son, Commodus, succeeded him with none of that discipline. Rome entered an era not of decline in numbers, but of spirit, where leadership wavered, and the line between governance and vanity blurred. Commodus fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, dined like a god, renamed the months of the year after himself. Rome still stood, the armies still marched, the taxes were still collected, but the rot was setting in beneath the polished veneer. And so, as the 2nd century came to a close, the world felt colder. Not in temperature, but in clarity. The old certainties of order, of virtue, of Rome as an eternal engine, began to dim. The plague had passed, but its shadow lingered. The borders still held, but barely. And from the fog beyond the limes, the storm gathered. Soon it would break. The storm did not break all at once. It whispered first, through the banners of discontented legions, through the rusting hinges of forgotten frontier gates, and through the quiet betrayal of a boy emperor, alone and out of time. In the year 235, Emperor Severus Alexander was murdered by his own troops. They had grown weary of his peacemaking ways, his mother's counsel, his failure to bring decisive war to the restless Germanic tribes. Some say he was still pleading for mercy when the blades came down. Others say he died silently, stunned by the final turn of loyalty. It was the first drop of blood in what would become a flood. Over the next 50 years, Rome would know no peace. One emperor after another, soldier generals wrapped in purple by the will of their legions, seized power, only to be cut down in turn. Some ruled for years, most for mere months. 26 emperors rose in 5 decades, and of those nearly all met violent ends. Assassinated by guards, poisoned by rivals, slain in battle, or simply cast aside and forgotten. the empire became a game board soaked in blood. In the west, one general would march on Rome. In the east, another would declare himself Caesar. The Danube frontier grew wild with ambition. Cities switched allegiance by torchlight. Senators held their breath with every new name etched onto imperial coin. The purple robe no longer symbolized eternity. It had become a death sentence. Loyalty frayed at every level. Governors eyed their neighbors with suspicion. Legions grew more loyal to their own commanders than to the idea of Rome itself. Battles were no longer just against the barbarian hordes. They were waged between Romans, with brothers turning swords on brothers under different banners. And while civil war burned through the heart of the empire, the borders crumbled. Goths and Franks swept across the Rhine. Persians pressed into Mesopotamia. Desert kings raided from Arabia. The frontiers, once guarded by proud forts and garrisons, now flickered like torches caught in the wind. In the capital, statues were recarved with new faces. Temples were rededicated, only to be forgotten again. The gods of Rome looked on in silence as generals crowned themselves emperors in tents, on battlefields, or at the point of a sword. The divine order, Ordo Romanus, had begun to unravel. And yet, for all this chaos, Rome did not fall. It staggered, reeled, bled from every wound, but it did not yet die. The city still stood, the Senate still gathered, the aqueduct still flowed. But beneath it all, the empire had entered a new rhythm, not one of peace and prosperity, but of survival. The age of gilded marble was over. Now came the reign of iron and blood. It was no longer one empire, not truly. On a map, Rome still stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, but in reality, it was crumbling like dry parchment, flaking away at the edges. Loyalty had become a currency, and in the vacuum of true power, new realms rose, not from outside Rome, but from within her very bones. By the year 260 CE, the Roman world had split into three competing fragments. In the west, the Gallic Empire emerged, carved from Gaul, Germania, Britannia, and Hispania by a general named Postumus. He had been tasked with defending the Rhine frontier, but when the chaos from Rome grew too loud, he chose to rule instead. His soldiers hailed him as emperor. His coins bore eagles and laurels. His cities held games and ceremonies, all as if he were the true Caesar. In the east, the rich and trading power of Palmyra grew bold. Under the fierce and brilliant Queen Zenobia, it became more than a client state. It became an empire. She ruled in her son's name, but it was her ambition that burned in every decision. Palmyra seized Egypt, marched into Asia Minor, and issued its own coinage. Roman in art and language, but Eastern in soul, Palmyra stood like a jeweled dagger pointed at the empire's throat. And between these sundered states, in the scarred middle ground, sat the old Rome, the official empire, though it barely resembled its former self. Emperors were still crowned there, still whispered to the Senate and posed for statues, but their grasp was weak. The roads to the provinces had grown long and treacherous. Letters arrived late, if at all. The legions, split and weary, could not be everywhere. The heart of the empire beat on, but the limbs moved of their own accord. What had once been a single pulse of command and obedience now stuttered in confusion. A battle in Gaul might go unreported for months. A rebellion in Syria might go unanswered. The once mighty machine of administration, posts, roads, messengers, now strained under its own broken weight. And yet, in each of these breakaway states, Rome lived on, like fractured mirrors reflecting the same fading light. The Gallic emperors styled themselves protectors of Roman tradition. Palmyra claimed to act in defense of Rome's eastern flank. Even as the empire fell apart, its image, its idea, was too powerful to discard. But an idea cannot hold back armies. It cannot mint uncorrupted coin. It cannot rebuild what ambition has shattered. The empire had not yet fallen, but it had ceased to be whole, and the cracks would only widen. As the swords fell silent, even for a moment, the empire found no rest. Instead, another kind of affliction crept in. Not foreign legions, but fever. Not rebellion, but rot. It began, they say, in Ethiopia, or perhaps Egypt, and from there rode the trade winds northward like a silent tide. The people called it the Plague of Cyprian, named for the bishop who described its horrors in trembling sermons. And alongside the sickness came inflation. Trust, so central to empire, was evaporating. Trust in money, in law, in leadership. The gods, it seemed, had turned their faces away, and in their absence, fear ruled. But through it all, the empire endured, shivering, staggering, burning the furniture to keep the fire alive. Rome had suffered disaster before: floods, fires, sackings, scandals, but never this kind of slow suffocation, this grinding down of breath and blood. It was not a storm that would pass. It was the air itself, growing thin. Imagine the empire now, not as a solid shape, but as a tattered banner rippling in a bitter wind. Provinces no longer spoke with one voice. The roads, once smooth and patrolled, had turned to dust and silence in places. Towns lay half abandoned. Roman law, once the heartbeat of civilization, was replaced in some corners by warlords and fear, and in the cities that still clung to order, there was weariness. You could smell it in the streets, the acrid sting of burnt grain, the sour rot of abandoned markets, the bitter incense rising endlessly from temples filled with unanswered prayers. And then came Aurelian, not from the noble lines of patrician Rome, but from the Danubian provinces, born among rough garrisons and windswept plains. A soldier's soldier, tall, severe, his face weathered by campaign fires and winter marches. There was no poetry to him, no stoic musings, only the rhythm of discipline and a vision forged in steel. When he was declared emperor in 270, many assumed he would vanish like the rest, another name in a line of shadows. But Aurelian was different. He moved like a blade through the fog. First he turned east. Palmyra, dazzling, exotic, arrogant, had declared itself sovereign. Its queen Zenobia ruled not with mere ambition, but with elegance and force. Palmyra was no backwater. It was a jewel of the desert, where Roman architecture met Persian splendor. Its avenues shimmered with imported marble. Date palms swayed between towering columns. Trade caravans laden with spices, silks and frankincense flowed through its gates like lifeblood. But Aurelian came with fire. His legions swept through Anatolia, burning away resistance like dried grass. He moved with a purpose, not just to punish rebellion, but to reclaim the soul of the empire. Palmyra fell. Zenobia was captured on the banks of the Euphrates, her royal chariot seized in the dust. Some say she was dragged through Rome in golden chains. Others say she walked with quiet pride, wrapped in eastern silks. A conquered queen, but not a broken one. Then westward, to the Gallic Empire. Gaul, Britannia, Hispania, they had broken away under the banner of Postumus and his successors. In the forests and river valleys of the north, Roman identity had blurred. Coins bore foreign names, temples were rededicated, and in the taverns of frontier towns, grizzled veterans whispered of a world where the old Rome no longer mattered. Aurelian gave them no such choice. He crossed rivers swollen with spring thaw, laid siege to rebel cities, and crushed resistance with ruthless speed. One by one they folded. Some surrendered outright, exhausted. Others fell in fire and fury. By 274 CE, Aurelian stood triumphant. The three sundered pieces of the empire now stitched, however tenuously, back together. And yet, his mind was not only on war. He returned to Rome, the city at the center of the world, and found it fragile. Not just militarily, but spiritually. The people were nervous, hollow-eyed. Grain prices had soared. Coinage was worthless. Crime filled the alleys by night, and even the temples felt strangely abandoned, as if the gods themselves had stepped back in doubt. So Aurelian built. He reformed the coinage, struck new silver with honest weight. He reopened the grain supply, secured shipments from Africa. He punished corrupt officials, sometimes with a sword, sometimes with exile. And he wrapped Rome itself in stone, commissioning the mighty Aurelian walls, stretching 12 miles around the capital, wide enough for 2 carts, tall enough to outlast fire and siege. You could hear the hammers all day, iron on marble, echoing down alleyways where children played amid rubble. A wall not just of defense, but of hope. To unite a fractured people, he turned to something older than politics, the sun. Aurelian declared Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, to be patron of the empire, a god for all, Eastern and Western, soldier and senator. Temples were built. The golden disc adorned coins. Festivals began again. The empire would be warmed and watched over by a single radiant force. And for a moment, it worked. There was calm. The market stirred. The roads felt safe. Children laughed again in the forums. And in the flickering torchlight of the curia, senators dared to hope. But empires are not rebuilt in a single lifetime. In 275 CE, on his way to crush a distant conspiracy, Aurelian was murdered, not by enemies, but by his own officers, tricked by forged letters and whispered lies. The man who had restored the world fell to a pen more than a sword. He was given no grand monument in life, no triumphal arch, but in the memory of Rome, he was called Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. And in an age of dust and blood, he stood, for a while, as proof that Rome could still remember how to stand tall. His reign was brief, but in that flicker of unity, the empire found breath again, a deep one, perhaps its last. The restoration Aurelian offered was glorious, but it was not enough. The fractures had been mended, not healed, and by the end of the 3rd century it became clear to all who wore the purple. The empire could no longer be ruled by one man alone. When Diocletian seized power in 284 CE, he did so with steel and certainty. He was not a philosopher king, nor a conqueror dreaming of laurels. He was a reformer, methodical, brilliant, and utterly unromantic. He saw Rome not as an ideal, but as a system that needed to be re-engineered, and from the quiet fields of Dalmatia to the halls of power, he began to reshape it. At the heart of his transformation was one great, unprecedented idea: that empire must be shared, not divided in defiance, as during the crisis, but organized, distributed with intent. Diocletian declared himself Augustus, senior emperor, and appointed a trusted officer, Maximian, as co-Augustus in the west. Then he went further. Each of them would take a junior partner, a Caesar, trained to succeed them. Thus was born the Tetrarchy, 4 rulers, 2 senior and 2 junior, each assigned to a quadrant of the empire. 4 capitals emerged to match this new logic: Nicomedia in the east, Milan and Trier in the west, and Sirmium in the Balkans. Rome, once the sole heart of the world, became just another city in a broader constellation of power. No longer would the empire rely on the life or whims of a single man. Succession would be orderly, power would be local, decisions would be swift. In theory, it was perfect. In practice, it was the beginning of a new kind of Rome. To the people, the change was strange but necessary. The imperial image, once singular and radiant, now appeared in sets. Coins bore 4 faces. Official edicts carried 4 names. Statues of the Tetrarchs, stiff, identical, embracing, began to appear in cities from Antioch to Alexandria. Unity through uniformity, order through symmetry. But to the common Roman, life did not feel suddenly more stable. Taxes continued. Soldiers still passed through towns, requisitioning food and shelter. The distant officials, now multiplied, were still faceless in their demands, and the empire, though neatly quartered, still bore the scars of the century before. In some streets, children asked their parents, "Which Caesar rules us now?" And in darkened taverns, old men grumbled, "If 4 men must rule one empire, perhaps it is no empire at all." Still, Diocletian pressed on. This was no longer the Rome of Augustus. It was something else, something colder, sharper, more complex. The old republic's ghost had finally been exorcised. What remained was a machine of survival. And though Diocletian could not yet see it, his tetrarchy would mark the first formal step toward division. A line not just of administration, but of identity. The East and West were no longer reflections. They were becoming different worlds. In the cool early light of dawn, the streets of a provincial Roman town stir to life, not with joy or laughter, but with obedience. Bakers stoke their ovens in silence. Farmers pass the gates carrying grain they can't afford to keep. A herald unfolds a parchment and nails it to the magistrate's wall. New tax edicts, new census orders, new penalties for tradesmen who underdeliver. The people do not gather to cheer. They gather to read, to memorize, and to worry. This is Diocletian's empire now. The reformer emperor, forged in hardship and rule by survival, saw clearly what had eluded his predecessors, that the empire could no longer be a living myth. It had to become a machine. With the flick of a stylus, he redrew the map, splitting provinces into manageable shards, overseen by layers of governors, comptrollers, and inspectors. There were now more officials than poets, more scribes than soldiers in some cities. Rome, once the mother of the world, was reduced to a ceremonial afterthought. Power now flowed from Milan, from Nicomedia, from Trier, far from the Senate's fading echo. The dioceses, great administrative blocks, sorted men, land, grain, and taxes like gears in a watch. Every man was counted, every field assessed, every trade fixed. If your father was a smith, you would be too. If your farm lay in the wrong quarter, you might be moved. The empire no longer trusted chance, only structure. In towns, life became still, not quiet, but heavy. The scent of the bakery mixed with dust from new roads and old coin. Citizens lined up at census stations, eyes lowered. Murmurs filled bathhouses and temples. They say the governor now answers to another governor. Or, my neighbour's son was taken for the army last night. No warning. Suspicion trickled through the cracks like water in a rotting beam. And outside the walls, things hardened further. The frontiers were no longer guarded by roaming legions alone. Diocletian formed the limitanae, soldiers tied to the land, farmers who trained with weapons and watched the horizon while tending barley. Alongside them stood the comitatenses, mobile field armies ready to be summoned at a moment's notice. The empire had grown too wide for one defence, so now it pulsed with readiness, like a body on constant alert. Even civilian dress changed. More uniforms, more badges of rank. The toga, once a symbol of Roman pride, gave way to cloaks, belts, tunics. Practicality over pageantry. Identity came not from where you lived, but what function you served. And hovering above it all was Diocletian himself, no longer a man, but a presence. He did not walk marketplaces or listen to crowds. He stood veiled behind ceremony, surrounded by silence. He was called Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. One did not approach the emperor. One bowed. One knelt. One obeyed. It brought a kind of peace, not the jubilant kind of Augustus's golden age, but a brittle, measured stillness. People paid their taxes, roads remained open, revolts were fewer. But beneath that calm was unease, for the state now felt vast, faceless, and inescapable. A shopkeeper in Antioch might speak in hushed tones of distant tax collectors with foreign accents. A mother in Pannonia might cry softly when her youngest was pressed into frontier service. A Christian family in Numidia might kneel in secret, fearing the next round of purges. And across the empire, shrines to Sol Invictus burned night and day, the unconquered sun shining from every coin, every edict, every statue niche. Rome still lived, but no longer in marble. Now, it marched in boots, it counted in ledgers, and it watched, always watched, from behind the imperial veil. There were still temples in the cities, grand echoing halls of stone, where the old gods of Rome watched in silent judgment. Incense rose toward painted ceilings. Priests in crimson stoles murmured prayers to Jupiter, to Mars, to Minerva. But the crowds were thinning, not gone, but uneasy. Eyes shifted at every whisper. People knelt, yes, but more out of fear than faith. Diocletian had tolerated them at first. He was not a cruel man by nature, but a man of order, and Christians, with their underground networks and spiritual defiance, represented disorder. They did not fit within his perfectly gridded world. They could not be taxed by temple offerings. They could not be controlled by fear of the old gods. And worst of all, they did not kneel before his image. So in 303 CE, he struck. The great persecution began with the stroke of a pen, an edict ordering all churches destroyed, scriptures burned, and Christians stripped of legal rights. Soldiers tore down altars in the night. Mosaics were smashed. Scrolls were fed to fire. In marketplaces, magistrates set up portable altars to test loyalty, burn incense, or face arrest. In some cities, Christians complied, quietly, reluctantly. In others, they resisted. Prisons overflowed. Executions followed. Martyrs were made. Bishoprics were emptied and filled again in secret. Across Africa, Gaul, Syria, and the Danube frontier, stories spread. of women refusing to renounce Christ, of soldiers who tore off their uniforms rather than curse the name they now followed, of entire congregations sent to the lions or the sword. And still, the faith grew. Diocletian, for all his precision, had miscalculated. The more he pressed, the more visible they became. The blood of the martyrs, as some would later say, became the seed of the church. In the villas of senators, whispers spread. My niece has become a Christian. In garrisons, the captain praised to a God who was crucified. Even in the palace, as it was said, some scribes, even eunuchs, had begun to hide symbols beneath their tunics. The empire still looked strong. Its walls were tall, its legions disciplined, its laws neatly penned and duplicated across the provinces. But inside, cracks widened. The illusion of unity, of religious and civic obedience, was just that, illusion. Diocletian would abdicate in 305 CE, retreating to a palace by the sea, his gardens filled with statues and silence. He would tend to his cabbages, it is said, proud of the empire he had ordered and restored. But what he could not see, or refuse to admit, was that beneath the marble, Rome had changed. The old gods were waning. A new faith was rising, and the world he had shaped so carefully was slipping, already, beyond his grasp. The Tetrarchy still stood, but its foundation trembled, quietly, beneath the cross. And so Diocletian, once the architect of order, once Lord and God, withdrew, not in disgrace but by his own will. He left the purple behind and settled into a palace on the Dalmatian coast, where he tended to gardens and statuary, and refused, even when begged, to return to power. Rome, he believed, was in steady hands. But it was not. The Tetrarchy he had so carefully constructed dissolved almost immediately. Succession was not peaceful. It never had been. Ambition flared. Rivals rose. Civil war returned like an old ghost, and the imperial diadem passed from hand to hand like a cursed relic. Out of this swirling storm, from the camps of Britain and the bloodied roads of Gaul, emerged a figure who would not just seize power, but change the empire's soul. Constantine, a man of military discipline and divine visions, a ruler who would not only win battles, but alter the very axis of faith and power. Under him, Rome would turn its gaze eastward, drape its temples in crosses, and raise a new city from the shores of the Bosporus, a city that would carry the empire's name and much of its fate for 1,000 years to come. The age of the old gods was ending, and in its place, a new empire was being born, not in marble and myth, but in scripture and symbol, in swords and synods. The world that Constantine inherited was no longer whole. The old Tetrarchy had crumbled into rival thrones. Emperors and would-be emperors clashed across provinces, raising armies in the names of ancestors, gods, and destiny. And yet, amidst this chaos, something quieter and deeper was unfolding. Christianity, once whispered in secret, now flickered in the open. The churches that survived Diocletian's purge were being rebuilt. In marketplaces, the sign of the fish was scratched in dust. In homes, crosses were carved into door frames. And in the hearts of the poor, the enslaved, even some nobles, a new allegiance was rising. One not pledged to Rome, but to Christ. Constantine, born of imperial ambition and hardened by campaign life, was no priest, but he was a reader of omens. And what he saw, in the winds of power, in the shifting loyalties of the army, in the flickering flame of Christian endurance, was a new force waiting to be harnessed. At first, he did not declare allegiance, he merely tolerated. But as his rivals multiplied and the empire splintered, Constantine did something no emperor had done before. He embraced the church, not in private, not cautiously, but with banners and coins, with public favor and imperial blessing. Christianity was no longer an enemy of Rome. It was to be its pillar. In 312 CE, just before a decisive battle that would change his life, Constantine reportedly saw a vision in the sky, a cross of light above the sun, and the words, "In hoc signo vincis," "In this sign you will conquer." That night, he ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian Chi Rho on their shields, and from that moment, a transformation began, not sudden, but unstoppable. As his power grew, Constantine looked east, not toward the Rome of memory, but toward the rising wealth of the Greek-speaking world. Alexandria, Antioch, Nicaea, these cities bustled with trade, theology, and strength. The East was vibrant, more defensible, more prosperous. Rome, by contrast, felt heavy, a monument, a memory of itself. So Constantine made a decision as bold as it was irreversible. He would build a new capital, one shaped in his own vision. On the site of ancient Byzantium, straddling the narrow waterway between Europe and Asia, he laid the foundations of Nova Roma, later called Constantinople, a city of 7 hills, ringed with mighty walls, crowned with Christian churches, imperial forums, and palaces of stone and gold. A city not of the past, but of the future. From this city, Rome would live on, but not as it had been. The Senate remained, but its voice faded. Latin lingered, but Greek rose in its place. The gods of old lingered only in statue niches and half-forgotten rites. The empire, once bound to the Tiber, was now gazing toward the Bosporus, and Christianity, once hunted in cellars, now stood in sunlight. Constantine was not baptized until his final days. His faith perhaps was part politics, part revelation, but his policies left no doubt. Bishops now advised the emperor. Church councils were convened by imperial command, and the cross, once a symbol of torture, now crowned the empire's banners. The transformation was not just spiritual, it was geopolitical, it was cultural, it was irreversible. And while many still clung to the old rites, the soul of Rome was shifting, slowly, steadily, toward a new age. The sun hung low over the western horizon, casting long shadows across the Roman camps pitched beside the river Tiber. Autumn leaves drifted over muddy roads. The air was thick with smoke, roasted grain, horse sweat, and the sting of forge fire where blacksmiths prepared armor late into the night. And amidst the tents, beneath the flapping of war banners, a strange energy moved among the soldiers. Constantine stood on the brink of a civil war that would determine the future not only of Rome, but of faith itself. His rival, Maxentius, held the city, defended by walls, wealth, and divine omens of his own. The people of Rome were weary, caught between fear of siege and loathing of their own ruler's cruelty. Maxentius, though hailed as emperor, was no hero. His reign in the West had been marked by cruelty, heavy taxes, and broken alliances. The Senate supported him with clenched teeth. The people quietly prayed for change. Constantine, meanwhile, had marched from Gaul, swift, decisive, unexpected, and the night before the battle, legend says, he looked to the sky and saw a sign. a cross of light or perhaps a radiant monogram, XP, Chiro, blazing above the sun. Alongside it, a voice, or a dream, or a feeling. In this sign you will conquer. The next morning, his soldiers marched with shields marked in that holy symbol, not the eagle of Jupiter, not the thunderbolt of Mars, but the emblem of a crucified god. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge, in 312 CE, was swift and brutal. Constantine's forces, though outnumbered, pushed forward with discipline and fury. Maxentius, in arrogance or panic, ordered his troops to defend the bridge, but the retreat turned to chaos. Horses bucked, men fell into the river. Maxentius himself drowned beneath the weight of his armor, dragged under as the city he once ruled cheered his death. Rome opened its gates. Constantine entered not as a conqueror, but as something more mythic, a chosen victor carrying not just the sword, but the cross. Months later, in 313, he met with Licinius, the Emperor of the East, in the city of Milan. There, in cool marble halls hung with purple drapery, they signed the Edict of Milan, a declaration that would echo through eternity. It did not make Christianity the official religion, not yet, but it did something even more powerful. It made Christianity legal. No more secret meetings, no more hidden scrolls. Churches were rebuilt with state money. Property was returned. Bishops were elevated. For the first time in its history, the Roman Empire had publicly embraced tolerance, at least in writing. And with tolerance came transformation. But Christianity was no longer a single voice. As the faith rose from catacombs to cathedrals, it brought with it all the fractures and debates that had long simmered beneath the surface. Doctrines clashed. Was Christ fully divine, or something lesser? Was God singular or triune? Bishops argued in letters, in pulpits, in marketplaces. Congregations split over a single phrase, a single Greek letter. Heresies multiplied as fast as churches. Constantine, practical and newly pious, realized the danger. A divided church could fracture the empire anew. And so, in 325 CE, he called the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council in Christian history. Hundreds of bishops traveled from across the empire, in carts and caravans, on foot and ship. Some arrived blind or maimed from Diocletian's persecutions. Others wore rings of gold and robes trimmed in silk. They gathered in the basilica at Nicaea, a swirl of languages, traditions, temperaments. There was tension, humility, pride, and prophecy. At stake, the soul of Christian belief. One group, led by the priest Arius, claimed that Christ was created by God, exalted, but not eternal. Others, led by Athanasius of Alexandria, thundered that Christ was consubstantial, of the same essence as the Father. It was not just theology, it was identity, power, unity. Constantine presided in a golden robe, not to dictate, but to mediate. He spoke not as pope, but as emperor. Still, his presence loomed large, and when the dust settled, the Nicene Creed was born, a declaration of belief, forged in disagreement, meant to unify the faithful across the world, a symbol of certainty in a time of chaos. And yet, outside those walls, across the empire, the debates would continue, factions would deepen, councils would be overturned, heresies would rise again. Unity, as always, was an illusion clung to with trembling hands. But for now, under the rising shadow of Constantine's cross, the empire stood aligned, a sword in one hand, a creed in the other. The Bosporus shimmered beneath a pale sky, where gulls wheeled over cold waves. and the mists of dawn clung to the low hills like a veil. Fishermen pulled in nets along pebble-strewn shores, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to believe, that history itself was about to settle in their harbour. For centuries, Byzantium had stood as a modest Greek port, ancient, sturdy, unremarkable. But in 324 CE, Constantine looked upon its headland and saw a vision, a crossroads between worlds, Europe to the west, Asia to the east, a narrow strait dividing oceans, guarded by the sea and a deep anchorage. It was not merely strategic, it was symbolic. Rome, the eternal city, had become heavy with its own past. Its monuments were cracked, its politics poisoned. Its temples, once mighty, now whispered to indifferent gods. And Constantine, still emperor, still ambitious, and now baptized by history itself, resolved to leave it behind. He would build a new capital. The work began at once. Laborers, architects, sculptors, and engineers summoned from across the empire. Temples and basilicas rose in tandem. Public forums were paved in white marble. Statues of gods and emperors were shipped from across the provinces. Apollo beside Christ, Alexander beside Moses. Streets were laid out to mimic the grandeur of Rome, but the spirit was changing. Incense still wafted from altars, but now it mingled with the smoke of Christian censers. Psalms echoed where once had been odes. Crosses were etched into stones that had once borne the eagle. This city, Constantine declared, would be a new Rome, but more than that, a sanctified one. And so, in 330 CE, with ceremony, procession, and prayer, he inaugurated the city as Constantinople, the city of Constantine. People came by the thousands, soldiers, scribes, merchants, monks. Along the harbours, markets overflowed with saffron and olives, bolts of silk and crates of wax tablets. Public squares bustled with dialects, Latin, Greek, Syriac, Armenian. Ships from Alexandria docked beside fishing boats from Thrace, and rising above them all, the sound of hammer and chant, of churches being raised, of hymns replacing the shouts of street orators. It was a city born in transition. To the common people, Constantinople shimmered with promise. The streets were wider, the aqueducts newer, taxis for a time gentler. It smelled of wet stone, roasted chickpeas, and the sharp sweetness of myrrh. Children chased each other past marble lions. Monks whispered verses as they walked beside merchants arguing in Aramaic. It was a place both ancient and unfamiliar, like Rome in a dream. To the elite, it was an opportunity, new palaces to fill, new ranks to claim, but also a risk. Many senators stayed behind, uneasy with the eastward pull. In their villas along the Tiber, they muttered that Constantine had abandoned tradition, that Rome was no longer the heart, but merely a scar. And yet Constantine did not turn back. He poured resources into his city. He filled it with law courts and imperial offices. He declared it protected by the Virgin Mary herself. Pagan temples were tolerated, but subtly de-emphasized. Gold flowed into basilicas. Relics of saints were interred beneath altars. The Christian Empire was no longer an idea. It now had an address. And in time, Constantinople would come to rival, even outlive, Rome herself. Its walls would stand for 1,000 years. Its libraries would shelter ancient knowledge. Its cathedrals would ring with hymns long after the Western Empire fell into silence. But in this moment, at its birth, it stood fragile, brilliant, and full of contradiction. A city of angels and emperors, of markets and martyrs, of stone, incense, and vision. Constantine had not merely moved the capital, he had shifted the axis of the world. In the quiet moments of his later years, Constantine would often withdraw from the noise of court, from bishops and generals, from petitions and ceremonies, and walk the gardens of his imperial palace in Constantinople. There, among the laurel hedges and whispering fountains, the emperor who had conquered in the name of Christ reflected on a life still wrapped in paradox. For though Constantine is remembered as the first Christian emperor, his soul was never easy to define. He had seen visions, yes. He had built churches, embraced bishops, and called councils. He had raised the cross beside the imperial eagle, reshaping the spiritual identity of the empire. And yet, he was never baptized until his deathbed. He maintained the title of Pontifex Maximus, High Priest of the old Roman religion. He ordered the preservation of certain pagan temples. He invoked both God and Son in his proclamations, hedging the divine, perhaps, as one would hedge armies on a battlefield. To his allies, he was the chosen instrument of providence, a Roman Moses. To his critics, even among the faithful, he was a man of ambition cloaked in piety. Some bishops feared his meddling in theology, others adored his favor and influence. But all knew this: Constantine had forever changed the relationship between crown and altar. He built not just a city, but a world where emperors would forever walk beside the church, sometimes as patrons, sometimes as masters. But while the empire shifted toward the divine, Constantine remained deeply concerned with the mortal, especially the future of his bloodline. Dynasty had always been a Roman obsession, and Constantine was no exception. He appointed his sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, as Caesars. He gave them provinces, armies, and tutors. He hoped they would rule in harmony, carry his reforms forward, and preserve both empire and faith. But harmony would not come. The succession was blood-stained. Upon his death in 337 CE, violence erupted. Relatives were purged, councils reversed, doctrines shifted. His sons warred with each other, carving the empire into personal fiefdoms. Arianism, the very heresy Constantine had tried to silence at Nicaea, flared anew, sometimes with imperial support. And yet, through all this turbulence, Constantine's shadow remained. His face adorned coins and mosaics. His laws persisted. His basilicas became pilgrimage sites. In the West, where emperors would one day kneel before popes, his memory was invoked as proof that throne and altar could walk hand in hand. In the East, his city grew stronger with each passing generation, a lighthouse of learning and faith for centuries to come. Even the Church, divided as it was, remembered him with a strange reverence. Some called him equal to the apostles, others questioned his motives, but all agreed something had shifted. He had not merely embraced Christianity. He had intertwined it with power, with statecraft, with symbols, with swords and scrolls. And so, as Constantine's body was laid to rest, not in a pagan necropolis, but within the Church of the Holy Apostles, among relics and saints, the old order of Rome, which had endured for 1,000 years, was at last fading into twilight. In its place stood a cross, golden, imperial, and rising. There was still on the maps a single Roman empire. Its banners flew above both marble basilicas and sun-bleached forts. Its laws echoed from Britain to Judea. The emperors wore the same purple, and the coins, stamped in their image, passed through every marketplace from Gaul to the Nile. But behind this symmetry, something was unraveling. The eastern and western halves of the empire were growing strange to each other. In the Greek-speaking East, cities thrived. Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, rich with trade, silk, spices, and theology. The streets teemed with debate. Monks argued doctrine in alleyways. Councils assembled to determine the very nature of Christ. Education flourished. Bureaucracy thickened. The church and the palace grew closer, intertwined like vine and stone. Greek was not just the language of business, it was the language of the soul. In the Latin West, things were harder. Rome, though still revered, was no longer central. Its senators held titles but little power. The emperors moved between Milan, Trier, and eventually Ravenna, seeking safety rather than ceremony. Roads were cracking. Villas stood half empty. The countryside grew wild, and the garrisons along the Rhine and Danube filled with recruits who no longer called Rome home. The languages began to part. The philosophies diverged. In the East, emperors debated metaphysics. In the West, they bargained with warlords. And beneath it all, a deeper tension stirred, theological and cultural. The Eastern Church leaned into mysticism, hierarchy, and intricate Christology. Councils weighed words like gold. The Greek fathers wrote of logos, ousia, hypostasis, terms as delicate as glass and heavy as stone. In the West, faith was simpler, more legalistic, more Roman in structure. Latin fathers like Ambrose and Augustine wrote of law, grace, and order. Unity was prized, but clarity often clashed with nuance. The Church was becoming two hearts beating out of sync. East and West prayed to the same God, but in different tongues and toward different priorities. Even the clergy began to wear their robes differently. Their rites diverged. Their fasts did not align. Bishops began to speak less of the empire as a whole, and more of our part of it. An Antiochene priest might not recognize the practices of a bishop in Gaul, and while both held communion as sacred, even the bread began to differ, leavened in the East, unleavened in the West. These were not yet schisms, not yet. But they were separations, small, steady, and unspoken, and as the weight of governance grew, emperors found it easier to lean inward. Arcadius in the east answered not to Honorius in the west, nor the reverse. Each ruled their domain like a full empire. Each issued their own edicts. Their courts, their styles, even their economies began to drift. It was still one empire, but it no longer felt like one. And just beyond the borders, from the shadowed forests of Germania to the snowy steppes of the north, the pressure began to build. He rose from Hispania, tall, solemn, a soldier of discipline and quiet vision. When Theodosius was summoned to power in the year 379, the empire was bleeding. The Gothic War had left the eastern frontier gasping for stability. Armies were shattered, emperors had died in the dust, and Rome, still called whole in name, was being held together by ink and memory. But Theodosius brought with him a peculiar gravity, not charisma, not force, but resolve. The city of Constantinople, still young and untested, embraced him like a second founder. His court whispered of restoration, of strength, of a final breath of unity. Yet behind the perfumed walls of the imperial palace, the world outside continued to splinter. The Gothic foederati, barbarian tribes invited in under treaty, walked Roman soil now, but not as Romans. In the taverns and bathhouses of Thrace, citizens muttered that the empire had let wolves into its fold. And in Antioch and Alexandria, theological riots flared like lightning storms. Christ was declared divine, human, both, neither, and bishops were dragged from altars in the name of Orthodoxy. Theodosius made a choice. He would not be a pagan emperor tolerating a Christian world. He would be a Christian emperor, enforcing a Christian order. In 380, he issued the Edict of Thessalonica, declaring Nicene Christianity the official religion of the empire. No more hedging, no more compromise. The state would follow the creed of Nicaea: one God, one Christ, one church. Temples were closed, sacred fires extinguished. Statues of old gods stood like forgotten guests at a feast they no longer belonged to. In the streets of Rome, a hush fell over the Vestal virgins, a priesthood that had outlasted kings, now dismissed by imperial decree. The great Serapeum in Alexandria, center of the old Egyptian religion, was stormed and destroyed. Some said a mob did it in ecstasy. Others whispered it was orchestrated from above. Either way, the dust that rose from its shattered columns marked the passing of an age, and through it all, Theodosius remained unmoved. In his mind there was no contradiction. An empire that worshipped one god would be stronger, more stable, eternal. But not everyone believed. Pagan senators clung to their rights in secret. Philosophers retreated to countryside estates, writing laments to the vanishing gods. Some believed the earth itself groaned as the old ways died. Others said the gods were retreating, not in defeat, but in silence, watching. Theodosius held the east. Then in 394, after the death of the western usurper Eugenius, who had briefly backed a pagan revival, Theodosius marched west, triumphant. His legions crossed the Alps in the early mist, banners crowned with Christian symbols. The two halves of the empire were, once more, under a single ruler. For a moment, a flicker, Rome was whole. But that moment would not last. On January 17th, 395, Theodosius died in Milan, sudden, quiet, and too soon. Some say he had foreseen it. Others whispered poison. Some believed he died of exhaustion. The weight of a world carried too long on one man's shoulders. His sons, Arcadius and Honorius, inherited the east and west. Children, really, unready, surrounded by courtiers and generals with sharper knives than principles. And thus the final breath of unity faded with his last. No new emperor would ever rule both halves again. The border between east and west, once drawn with ink, hardened in the dusk, not through war, but through weariness, through habit, through drift. A door quietly closing, not with a crash, but with a sigh. The last emperor of a united Rome lay in state, his body veiled in purple, his soul commended to the Christian God. And all around him, the world moved on. The imperial procession moved through the streets of Milan like a shadow stretched across stone. Veiled mourners followed priests bearing incense, the cold January air mixing frankincense with the smell of horses and damp wool. Behind them, the body of Theodosius I lay silent, wrapped in imperial purple, his hands crossed over his chest, his eyelids pressed shut like gates closed to the world. Some wept openly, others only watched. For all his power, his proclamations, his edicts, Theodosius had passed like all others. The man who had held the Roman world in his grasp was gone, and with him, something ancient fractured. His two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, inherited an empire still joined in law, but now divided in blood. Arcadius ruled from Constantinople, pale, anxious, surrounded by whispering ministers and eunuchs who shaped his words before they left his lips. Honorius ruled from Milan, and later Ravenna, a boy barely into his teens, guarded by the powerful general Stilicho, who many said was the true ruler of the West. There was no coronation of unity, no ceremonial sharing of power, just a quiet bifurcation, two courts, two bureaucracies, two visions of what Rome was meant to be. And though letters still crossed between capitals, and laws still carried the name of the same empire, it was, in truth, no longer one world. Messengers from the east arrived to find unfamiliar dialects. Governors met foreign customs. Even coinage began to diverge. Slightly at first, then unmistakably. Where once Rome had been a single pulse stretching from ocean to desert, it now beat with two hearts, slowly drifting apart. Rumours stirred beneath the surface. In Antioch, it was said the West was ruled by barbarians. In Ravenna, whispers claimed the East had grown soft, more Greek than Roman, more priest than soldier. The divide was not only in courts, but in the air itself. Constantinople bustled with ships, silk and sermons, the scent of olive oil, parchment and sea. Ravenna, remote and marsh-bound, felt like a refuge rather than a capital. Damp stone, military camps, and watchful eyes. Rome, the old Rome, was scarcely involved. Still holy, still symbolically central, but in truth forgotten. Her senate sat in ceremony, her temples shuttered, her aqueducts still flowed, but her future lay behind her. The empire had split not in fire, but in frost, quiet, slow, irreversible. And so the crown, once whole, now gleamed in two separate halls, one cast in golden mosaics, the other dulled by northern winds. Two emperors, two worlds, and the long echo of unity fading behind them. In Constantinople the lamps burned late into the night. Scholars copied texts in flickering candlelight, while bishops debated the nature of Christ beneath domes painted with gold and fire. The harbour bustled with ships from Cyprus, Egypt, and the Black Sea, their sails striped with salt, their holds heavy with grain, silk, and scrolls. Guards stood in polished armour along the marble avenues. The city rang with church bells and chants in Greek. The court was slow-moving but orderly. Bureaucrats argued over tax records with the intensity of generals. The East, the Eastern Roman Empire, had become a fortress of paper and prayer, stronger in finance, in theology, in walls, and at its heart stood a belief that order could be preserved, that Rome might endure, if not in name, then in structure, in the hum of commerce, in the measured cadence of law, in the shimmering mosaic of an emperor haloed like a saint. In the West, however, things were different. The court had withdrawn to Ravenna, a city half wrapped in marshes and melancholy. The boy emperor Honorius lived surrounded by generals, advisors, and the heavy silence of decline. Rome itself, though still sacred, was no longer imperial. Its streets grew worn, its colonnades gathered dust. Villas outside the city fell into ruin, their mosaics overgrown, their fountains dry. The frontier garrisons, once the pride of the legions, were now manned by foederati, foreign-born soldiers paid in grain and promises. The Latin tongue began to twist, the roads crumbled, the tax rolls grew thin, and in the taverns and temples, the people no longer spoke of eternity. They spoke of survival. The two empires no longer mirrored one another. The East had gold, the West had wolves at the door. The East wrote theology, the West begged for swords. One still dreamed of empire, the other braced for its end. And though the banners still bore the same eagle, the wind no longer carried them in the same direction. In Constantinople one could still believe that Rome endured, that it had simply changed robes, moved house, and baptized itself into a new age. But in the West, in Gaul, in Hispania, in Italy, Rome had begun to feel like a memory, like the statue of a god whose temple is now a barn, still standing, but hollow inside. 2 emperors ruled, 2 courts governed, 2 fates unspooled, and far beyond the Rhine and Danube the forest stirred, hoofbeats echoed in the dark. The West would not stand forever, but for now, it still called itself Rome. And somewhere in a crumbling villa, an old man scratched that name into a fading parchment, as if to hold the world together just a little longer. It did not begin with war, but with wind. A wind that came from the east, dry, sharp, and heavy with the scent of smoke. The Huns, riding out of the steppes like ghosts in furs and iron, had dislodged 1,000 lives with their advance. They moved faster than scouts could report, their arrows whispering before warnings could be shouted. In their wake came the Goths, the Vandals, the Alans, the Suebi, tribes once distant and divided, now pressing at the frontiers not with swords, but with their children and cattle. Rome had seen barbarian incursions before, border raids, tribal skirmishes. But this was different. These were entire nations in motion, and in 376 the gates were opened. The Visigoths, pleading for shelter across the Danube, were allowed in, not out of generosity but necessity. The empire could not fight a war on every border, but what followed was not peace. Roman officials extorted the starving refugees, traded their children for dog meat, and broke every promise made. By the time the Goths rebelled, they did not rise as guests turned restless, they rose as people betrayed. The empire had begun to crack, not with invasion, but with cruelty. That crack would widen for decades, until it reached the heart. It was the year 410, and Rome had not been sacked in over 800 years. The empire had fractured. Emperors rose and fell. The army was filled with mercenaries and tribal commanders, and the government clutched at rituals long emptied of power. When Alaric, king of the Visigoths, marched toward the city, he did not do so in blind rage. He came with grievances, treaties broken, payments delayed. He asked for recognition, for land, for a future within the empire. He was denied, dismissed. Rome still believed itself eternal, so Alaric waited. He laid siege. For weeks the people inside starved. Dogs were eaten, rats were caught and skinned. The Tiber ran low and foul. Children cried in alleys, mothers went silent. And then one night the gates were opened, some say by slaves, others say by desperate citizens. 3 days of looting followed. Fires lit the skyline. Statues fell and were shattered for their bronze. Temples were ransacked, though Christian churches were strangely spared. The Forum echoed not with oratory, but with screams and the crunch of boots over broken marble. Senators hid in cellars. Noblewomen fled barefoot into the night. Jerome, in distant Bethlehem, wrote that it was the end of the world, and to many Romans, it was. Not because the city had fallen, but because no gods had saved it. Yet the empire did not die. Not then. It staggered to its feet. Emperors were crowned in Ravenna, Treaties were made with barbarian kings, granting them lands within imperial borders in exchange for loyalty that never quite arrived. The Vandals, once wanderers, crossed into Spain, then into North Africa. There they took Carthage, Rome's ancient enemy, and turned it into a new capital. It was a bitter irony. From Carthage, they launched fleets into the Mediterranean, raiding the coasts of Italy, Sicily, even Greece. In 455, they returned to Rome itself, not as petitioners, but as predators. This sack was worse. The gates were opened again, perhaps to avoid slaughter, but the result was devastation all the same. Genseric, king of the Vandals, stripped the city bare, gold from temples, marble from palaces, jewels from shrines. They looted not in chaos, but with method, like accountants of destruction. The sacred vessels taken from Jerusalem centuries before were stolen again. The people of Rome endured it in silence, in shame, in fear. No army came to save them. No divine thunderbolt struck the invaders down. The emperor was helpless. The gods were absent. Rome, once the mistress of the world, stood violated, hollow and mute. And then came the sound of hooves, louder than thunder. Attila. The scourge of God, as terrified bishops called him, rose from the east like a storm given form. His Huns were like nothing Rome had faced, fast, merciless, unbound by laws or oaths. They burned cities, slaughtered defenders, took no land, no temples, only fear. In 451, Attila crossed the Rhine and was met in Gaul by a coalition of Romans and Visigoths, strange allies drawn together not by loyalty, but by desperation. The Battle of the Catalonian Plains was a nightmare, dust, blood, and sky. No victor emerged, but Attila retreated. He had tasted Roman steel and did not choke. The next year he came again, this time into Italy. Cities emptied at his name. Entire towns fled into swamps and hills. Aquileia was destroyed so completely that later generations could not even find its ruins. The road to Rome lay open. But there he stopped. Why? Some say it was Pope Leo I who met him outside the city walls and spoke words that cooled even Attila's fury. Others say plague or lack of supplies. Still others believe that even the scourge of God felt something strange when facing the bones of empire. Rome was no longer powerful, but she was still haunted. Attila turned back. He died not long after, choking on blood in the night after a feast. His warriors buried him in secret, beneath a riverbed. The waters turned to flow over his tomb. His empire faded quickly, but the fear he sowed remained. For in his wake, Rome was left trembling, a house whose roof still stood, but whose beams had split beneath the weight of time. The wind did not howl when the Western Empire fell. The skies did not darken. No legion banners were torn down in grand defiance, and no temple doors were sealed with finality. It ended not with thunder, but with the whisper of resignation. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a patchwork, a memory stitched together with bribes and borrowed swords. Its armies were no longer Roman in name, let alone in blood. Its borders were held, if at all, by men who called themselves kings and dukes, not generals. In Italy, the boy emperor Romulus Augustulus was crowned in 475. A puppet, placed on the throne by his father, a military commander who ruled through shadow and intrigue. The boy was perhaps 13. He wore robes too long for his arms. He signed decrees he could barely read. His court resided in Ravenna, not Rome, safer, wetter, quieter, and across the sea in Constantinople, the Eastern court barely acknowledged his existence. For many, the empire in the West had already fallen. It just hadn't admitted it yet. In 476, a man named Odoacer, a barbarian general in Roman service, likely of Syrian or Gothic descent, marched into Ravenna at the head of his troops. He did not sack the city. He did not burn the palace. He simply demanded that the farce end. The Western Empire, he claimed, needed no emperor. It needed no boy in a purple robe. It needed order, and he would provide it. The child emperor was spared. Some say he was sent into exile with a pension. Others say he was quietly absorbed into monastic life, vanishing like a candle snuffed beneath a veil. Odoacer then sent the imperial regalia, the diadem, the purple cloak, the scepter, to Constantinople. A symbolic gesture. A statement that the West no longer needed a Caesar. That the idea of two emperors had come to an end. In the East, Emperor Zeno accepted the news with weary grace. There would be one Rome now, but only on parchment. In the cities of Italy, life went on. The baker rose early. The magistrate weighed grain. The churches filled with incense and prayers. But something had shifted, quietly and forever. The Western Roman Empire, which had once stretched from the windswept cliffs of Britannia to the sands of Egypt, was gone. Not destroyed in a single battle, but withered, season by season, decade by decade, until all that remained was ceremony and name. The Senate still met in Rome, occasionally, pointlessly. Laws were issued, rarely enforced. Villas crumbled, roads faded into dust. Latin would survive, in prayers, in laws, in the lullabies of villages, but the world it once ruled no longer answered. And yet, something of Rome remained, in the walls of monasteries, in the quiet prayers of bishops, in the stories passed down beside fires. The empire was gone, but the memory endured, like an ember in ash, waiting, dimming, but not yet cold. In the West, the lights had dimmed. Rome no longer ruled. It remembered. It prayed, but its voice had grown quiet. Yet far to the east, beyond the mountains of Thrace, beyond the fading frontier forts and the ghost towns of Gaul, the empire still breathed. Its heart no longer beat in the Forum or along the Tiber, but beside the Bosporus, in the great city of Constantinople. There, behind towering walls and candle-lit halls, Rome had not perished, it had transformed. And as the Latin West slipped further into feudal silence, the East began to speak in Greek, and dream in gold. It called itself Roman still, Basileia Romaion, the empire of the Romans. Its coins bore emperors crowned with crosses. Its courts ruled from scrolls written in Greek. Its churches stretched into the sky, filled with incense and the sound of voices rising in chant. And its capital, Constantinople, shone like a lantern hung between two continents. While the West dissolved into kingdoms and warlords, this empire endured. It no longer marched legions across Britannia or debated in the Senate of old, but it stood, stone by stone, century by century, while all around it, the world shifted and fell. Life within its walls moved at a different rhythm than the crumbling West. Ships from Egypt, Syria, and the Black Sea brought wheat, spices, oil, and glass. Markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Bureaucrats walked marble corridors clutching parchments and seals, debating tax codes written generations ago. Eunuchs held the ear of emperors. Scholars debated heresy and astronomy under golden domes. Its armies, while smaller, were disciplined, drawn from both citizen and foreign-born stock. Along the walls, guards stood watch not just for invaders, but for eternity, as if to say, Rome lives here now, behind this gate, within these mosaics, in every whispered prayer in the shadow of the Hagia Sophia. But though the empire endured, it had changed. It was no longer Roman in tongue or law or blood. Greek was its spoken word, Orthodox Christianity its beating heart. Caesar had become Basileus. The toga had given way to the jeweled robe. The Senate, long irrelevant, was a formality, a hollow echo of republican ideals. Yet the Byzantines, as we now call them, never called themselves anything but Romans. They were not a new empire. They were the continuation, refined, restructured, resilient. And they viewed the West with its feudal lords and Latin popes as fallen, broken, and estranged. The old union was lost. The dream of one Rome, one church, one emperor was slipping into myth. But even as kingdoms rose and fell beyond the Danube and Alps, Constantinople stood. Its triple walls, 40 feet thick in places, loomed above the Marmara like a mountain of intention. Pilgrims and ambassadors described the city as heaven on earth, a place where the divine and imperial coexisted, stitched together in glittering glass and liturgy. There were famines, riots, earthquakes, heresies, but always the city endured, and with it the Eastern Roman Empire, not the Rome of Caesars and conquest, but of candles and codices, of emperors who prayed as much as they ruled, and of a civilization that refused to let the fire go out. For while Constantinople dazzled from without, with its gleaming domes, great walls, and crowded harbours, it endured from within, through a framework of rule more intricate than marble, and more enduring than steel. This was no longer the Rome of grand republican ideals or citizen legions. It was a world ruled by ink, ritual, and the whispered judgment of chamberlains. Bureaucracy, vast, layered, meticulous, had become the backbone of the Eastern Roman state. Every village had its record, every tax its schedule, every border its watchman. The imperial chancery issued edicts in formal Greek, carefully phrased, sealed in lead, and carried by couriers trained to navigate a labyrinth of laws older than memory. Promotion came not through the battlefield, but through the palace corridor. A man could rise from humble origins to wealth and power if he mastered the forms, and bent to the rhythms of the court. Culture, too, had transformed. This was not the Latin literary world of Cicero and Virgil, but one shaped by Homer, Plato, and the Greek fathers of the Church. Education was prized, not for civic virtue, but for spiritual clarity and administrative competence. Children of the elite were taught to read the Gospels and the Iliad side by side. Poets wrote of saints and emperors alike. Theatre and rhetoric survived, but they bowed now to the church. Music filled the streets during feast days, chanted in the slow, hypnotic cadence of the Greek liturgy, and in monasteries carved into hillsides or tucked into corners of the capital, scribes copied texts by candlelight, preserving the knowledge of ancient worlds, even as new storms gathered beyond the frontiers. But if the empire had a soul, it was Orthodoxy. Not merely Christianity, but a particular ordered, dogmatic vision of it. Faith was not left to individual interpretation. It was guarded, debated, and enforced. The Church and the Emperor stood entwined, two branches of a divine order. Heresy was not just theological error, but treason. Councils were convened to settle disputes that split cities in two. Was Christ of one nature or two? Did the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father alone? or also from the sun? These were not idle questions. They were matters of identity, of empire, of eternal truth, and riots broke out over them as fiercely as they once had for chariot races or taxes. Bishops held political weight, monks stirred crowds, and emperors found themselves caught, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes zealously, in the great shaping of faith. All of it, the law, the church, the culture, the rituals, was bound together in a uniquely Byzantine fabric. Outsiders called it secretive, decadent, overly elaborate. But within the empire, it was seen as sacred precision, a world where every candle had its place, every hymn its tone, every gesture its meaning. It was a civilization that believed order reflected heaven, that to govern well was to preserve not just peace, but salvation. And so as kings warred in the west, and tribes clashed in forgotten forests, Constantinople endured not by sword alone, but by the quiet strength of form, of faith, and of memory. It is said that when Justinian I rose to power in 527 CE, the empire breathed a new ambition, one it had not dared voice in generations. He was not born in a palace, nor descended from old blood. He came from the Balkans, the son of peasants, raised by his uncle in Constantinople and shaped in the crucible of court life. But within him burned a vision, not just to govern, but to restore, to gather up the broken pieces of the old Roman world and fuse them into something lasting, divine, eternal. He did not wear the purple like a caretaker. He wore it like a prophet. And beside him stood his empress, Theodora, a former actress, a woman of sharp mind and unshakable presence, beloved by the poor, feared by the elite. Together, they would remake Byzantium, not just as an empire of survival, but as one of glory. The early years of Justinian's reign were marked by fire and fear. In 532, the city erupted into chaos during the Nicaea riots, a political and religious revolt sparked by factions of chariot fans, inflamed by taxes, injustice, and insult. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. Mobs set fire to palaces. The old Hagia Sophia, the great church of the city, was reduced to ash. Senators plotted to overthrow him. But Theodora, unshaken, whispered, "Purple makes a fine burial shroud." And Justinian stayed. He crushed the revolt with terrifying force. 30,000 people died, their bodies piled in the hippodrome where once cheers had echoed. And from the smoking ruins, he began to build anew. At the empire's heart, he raised the greatest church the Christian world had ever seen. The Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, was not built like other churches. It soared, it shimmered. Its architects, Anthemius and Isidore, fused Roman engineering with Eastern mystery. Brick by brick, dome upon dome, it rose like a second sky within the city. When it was complete, golden light pooled across polished marble. Candles flickered against mosaic walls. Incense drifted beneath the central dome, which seemed not to rest on stone at all, but on air and prayer. Upon entering, Justinian is said to have exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." And to those who entered, pilgrims, emperors, monks, it did feel as though the heavens had opened, and one had stepped into the vault of creation itself. But glory demanded more than beauty. Justinian turned his gaze westward, to the lost provinces of the Western Empire. His generals, most notably Belisarius, became legends. In lightning campaigns, they retook North Africa from the Vandals, reclaimed Italy from the Ostrogoths, and pushed deep into Hispania. The dream of Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the Roman Empire, no longer seemed a fantasy. For a moment, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake, but conquest was costly. Italy, ravaged by decades of war, was left in ruins. Rome was taken, then lost, then taken again. Entire cities were emptied. Fortresses stood amid ash. Belisarius, brilliant and loyal, was recalled more than once, caught in the emperor's web of jealousy and pride. And behind the triumphs, something darker crept through the streets of Constantinople. In 541, it began. At first, whispers, coughing, a few dead near the docks, then dozens, then thousands. The plague of Justinian swept through the empire like a shadow that could not be outrun. Carried by fleas, borne by ships, it killed without pattern. Some died in hours, others lingered in fevered agony. Corpses piled in alleyways, grave-diggers abandoned their tools, priests chanted funerals over empty crypts. Constantinople, the great light of the world, fell silent. Some say half the population died, others say more. Justinian himself caught the disease, raving, sweating, silent for days. But he survived. When he returned to governance, it was with hollow eyes. The empire would never fully recover, and yet it endured. The Reconquests faltered, the plague receded, enemies returned. But the Hagia Sophia still stood. The legal code Justinian had commissioned, the Corpus Juris Civilis, was completed, preserving and refining Roman law for generations to come. His reign, at once golden and grim, became a symbol of what Byzantium would always be, a realm of contradictions, splendor and suffering, sanctity and suspicion, restoration and rot. But through it all the vision survived, that Rome still lived here, in Greek words and domed churches, in the whisper of incense and the clink of the imperial seal, not the Rome of Caesar, but of candlelight and codices, not empire of the sword, but of enduring memory. And in the stones of the Hagia Sophia, polished by the feet of millions, that memory still glows, warm, distant, and eternal. By the time Justinian's bones rested beneath mosaicked ceilings, the Eastern Roman Empire had long since stepped into a world of its own making. Its emperors still called themselves Roman. Its laws echoed with the voice of Caesar. But its soul, now shaped by incense, icon, and creed, had begun to walk a different road from the lands that once shared its name. In the Latin West, a new kind of power was rising, not in emperors, but in popes, not in courts, but in cathedrals. Rome had fallen, but the Bishop of Rome had grown strong, and slowly, silently, a fracture was forming, not along rivers or borders, but along the very spine of Christendom. They had once spoken the same prayers. In Latin and in Greek, across basilicas from Antioch to Arles, the early Christians had gathered beneath vaulted ceilings, their voices lifted like smoke. They had suffered under the same persecutions, debated the same mysteries, and buried their saints in the same catacombs. But by the 11th century, that unity, so fragile, so long assumed, had worn thin. The Church, like the empire that had once housed it, was becoming two minds in two bodies. East and West still called each other brethren, still traced their lineage to Peter and Paul. But behind the courtesies and processions, there was distance now, and distrust. In Constantinople, the Church had become part of the rhythm of empire. The Patriarch was crowned in liturgical grandeur, walking in candlelit procession to Hagia Sophia. Emperors bowed before icons. Theology was debated in palaces and monasteries with the precision of legal code. The Orthodox faith was a living, breathing thing, shaped by councils, guarded by tradition, and soaked in centuries of Greek philosophy and imperial ritual. Meanwhile, in the West, the Church had grown into a power of its own, independent, assertive, and increasingly political. The Pope, Bishop of Rome, claimed authority over all Christendom, not just spiritual guidance, but primacy. The Western Church demanded unity, not as cooperation, but as obedience. And the people felt the difference. In Constantinople, the faithful stood during liturgy, watched icons kissed and censers swing. The air was thick with incense and Greek chant. Communion was given in both bread and wine, from a golden spoon. In Rome and Paris and Cologne, the laity knelt. The bread was unleavened, thin, crisp, like a wafer of sunlight. Latin prayers echoed in stone cathedrals where the Pope sat like a second emperor. The clergy wore different robes. Their saints had different names. Even the calendar sometimes disagreed. And though all called themselves Christian, they were no longer praying with quite the same heart. Tension simmered, over authority, over custom, over language. The cracks were not yet a break, but they had deepened, and somewhere between the Latin chants of the West and the Greek hymns of the East, the unity of the early Church was beginning to drift, like a candle flickering in a long, dark nave. It is one thing to tear a cloak at the seam. It is another to watch the fibers pull apart on their own, slowly, invisibly, until you look down and realize you are no longer wrapped in the same cloth. So it was with the Church. The divide between East and West was not born from a single argument or a single moment, but from centuries of drift, cultural, spiritual, political. And like two brothers raised in the same home but grown into different men, each side believed itself faithful and quietly judged the other as strayed. To the faithful in Constantinople, worship was a mosaic of mystery. Their liturgy was long, slow, sung. Gold and incense filled the domes. The divine was infinite and approached with awe, not defined by logic, but revealed through beauty. Icons watched from every surface, kissed by trembling lips. Scripture was read aloud in Greek, a living tongue, thick with meaning. And the bread, round, soft, leavened, was the risen body of Christ, a symbol not of suffering alone, but of resurrection, of victory over death. Communion was taken with wine, together, the body and blood, inseparable. To the Orthodox mind, this was not ritual. It was a door to the heavenly reality, a joining of earth and eternity. In the West, worship moved differently. The Latin Mass was measured and judicial, shaped by order and form. The Church was the guardian of truth, and truth required clarity, definition, decree, command. The Pope, seated in Rome, stood as the rock, the final interpreter, the vicar of Christ on earth. And so the bread used was unleavened, crisp, clean, without corruption. It recalled the Passover. It emphasized the sacrifice. It was, to them, more proper, more pure. The East, in turn, saw it as flat, lifeless, a symbol of a dead body rather than a risen one. And from these small, sacred differences, suspicion began to grow. The question of power lay beneath it all. The Pope, increasingly isolated from the East and surrounded by the rising kingdoms of the Franks and Germans, leaned into his authority. The Bishop of Rome no longer saw himself as first among equals, but as supreme, heir to St. Peter, whose binding and loosing shaped heaven itself. His voice, he believed, should rule all Christendom. But in Constantinople, where emperors still reigned and councils still mattered, this was unthinkable. The Patriarch was not subordinate. He was not a servant. He was a brother, and the Church, a communion of equals. No one man could reshape the faith handed down from apostles and saints, not even Peter's heir. And then came the Filioque. It began centuries earlier, in the forests of Gaul, a quiet addition to the creed, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. Filioque, a single word. But for the East it was a word that bent the Trinity, that introduced hierarchy into what was meant to be eternal relationship. More than that, it was changed without a council, without consensus. To change the creed was to tamper with the vessel of salvation. In the West, it was seen as clarification, a logical progression. In the East, it was seen as hubris, and the people felt it. In the marketplaces of Thessalonica, in the cloisters of Gaul, in the monasteries on Mount Athos and the abbeys of Burgundy, rumours and resentment rippled like wind across still water. This was no longer a debate about bread or words or titles. It was about vision. What was the Church meant to be? A fortress of truth ruled by a single voice, or a sacred symphony of traditions breathing together, held in tension and reverence? The East saw the West as rigid, legalistic, ambitious, consumed with rule. The West saw the East as mystical, disobedient, evasive, consumed with form and beauty. And each thought the other, perhaps, had lost the heart of Christ. So the distance widened, and where once there had been one church, one faith, one body, there now walked two shadows, circling the same altar, but no longer praying in unison. The year was 1054, summer in Constantinople. The air was heavy with the scent of jasmine and salt. The sea shimmered beneath pale skies. Pilgrims moved through the city streets, past beggars and philosophers, past the glowing mosaics of old shrines and the marble stairs worn smooth by centuries of sandals. And in the great church of Hagia Sophia, candles burned as they had always burned, tall, golden, unwavering. Nothing in the wind, nor the bell towers, nor the painted eyes of saints warned of what was to come. But something in the silence had changed. For years, tensions had grown. Between Pope Leo IX and Patriarch Michael Cerularius, between Rome and Constantinople, between Latin and Greek, between command and council. The Pope had sent envoys, Cardinal Humbert among them, not just to discuss, but to correct. He brought with him letters full of fire, words laced with the sharp edge of law, declaring that salvation flowed through Rome alone, and that the East had wandered too far. Cerularius, proud and unbending, refused to meet them. The doors of diplomacy closed. The halls of patience went quiet. So the envoys waited, and when waiting failed, they acted. On a bright July day, July 16th, as the liturgy was being sung within Hagia Sophia, as the choir rose and the congregation stood barefoot on cool marble, the papal legates walked down the nave, cloaks heavy, faces grim. Without a word, they approached the altar. Before the eyes of the clergy, before the icons and the saints, they placed a bull of excommunication upon the altar. It named Cerularius a heretic. It severed him from the Church of Rome. It cast out the East, not with swords, but with seals. And then they turned and walked out into the sunlight. There was a moment, small, still, dense with breath, when the world could have held, when letters might have been withdrawn and apologies exchanged. But the moment passed. Days later, Cerularius responded in kind. He excommunicated the Pope and his legates, not only their persons but the claims they stood upon. He denounced their pride, their innovations, their interference, and with the strike of his own pen, the wound deepened. Two churches, once one body, had torn each other from the Book of Life. The people outside the palace walls did not all understand what had happened. Fishermen still cast nets into the Bosporus. Priests still rang bells at Vespers. In villages and cathedrals across both east and west, prayers continued as they had the day before. But something invisible had shifted. A thread had snapped. A communion had died. And though both sides continued to call themselves the true church, and though centuries of war and peace would follow, they would never again kneel at the same altar. The Great Schism, as we now call it, was not a bolt of lightning. It was the slow turning of two great ships, passing in mist, their lanterns once bright and close, now dimmed by distance and pride. And behind them in the wake, centuries of echo, of sorrow, of misunderstanding, of hope lost and never quite regained. It had begun with holy vows, with banners raised and sermons preached, with the clang of sword upon shield and the promise of heaven for those who would take the cross. The Fourth Crusade, called in the name of Christ, was meant to march upon Jerusalem, to reclaim the Holy Land from the infidel, to restore what had been lost. Knights from France and Flanders answered the call. Their armour shone, their prayers were devout. But from the first step, the path turned crooked. They lacked ships, they lacked silver, and so they turned to Venice, the merchant republic that ruled the sea. The Doge, Enrico Dandolo, old and nearly blind, agreed to ferry them, but for a price. And when that price could not be paid, the crusade began to sell its soul, piece by piece. First, they attacked the Christian city of Zara to pay their debt. Then they listened, too eagerly, to a young Byzantine prince in exile, Alexios Angelos, who promised riches and allegiance if they would place him on the throne in Constantinople. He would pay them. He would unite East and West. He would heal the Schism. The promises glittered like coins in the dark. So the crusade turned, not to Jerusalem, but to Constantinople. The city rose before them like a vision, domes of gold, walls of white stone, sails fluttering on the sea wind, the cross of Christ soaring above all. Inside, the people watched in disbelief. These were not Saracens at the gates. These were Christians, brothers, but their ships did not come to kneel. They came to conquer. The first siege failed, the second succeeded, and on April 13th, 1204, the unthinkable happened. The Crusaders entered the holy city. What followed was not battle, it was desolation. For 3 days the city was looted, not by enemies of the faith, but by those who wore its sign on their chests. The Hagia Sophia, jewel of Christendom, was defiled. Soldiers stabled their horses in the narthex. A prostitute was crowned mock empress on the sacred altar, laughing as she danced in the smoke of stolen incense. Icons were smashed, relics stolen, monasteries burned. Noble women were dragged screaming through the streets. Priests were cut down in their robes. And the treasures of 1,000 years, golden chalices, silken vestments, manuscripts illuminated with the tears of monks, vanished into the hands of those sworn to defend them. The people of Constantinople never forgot, nor forgave. The wound carved that day went deeper than doctrine. It was not just a schism now. It was a betrayal, by the West, by Rome, by the very men who had once called themselves defenders of the faith. And though a Latin emperor was placed on the throne, and though the Crusaders tried to govern the shattered city, the light that had once burned at the center of Eastern Christendom had flickered and dimmed. When the Byzantines finally retook the city in 1261, they found it broken, the churches gutted, the treasures scattered across Europe, in Venice, in Paris, in Rome. The Hagia Sophia stood silent, hollow, scarred. The empire survived, but it would never truly recover. Its heart had been pierced, not by the scimitar but by the cross. And in that bitter silence, the final estrangement between East and West was sealed, not with theology, not with councils, but with flame and iron, echoing in the ruins of what had once been the world's most sacred city. The city was reclaimed, the banners were changed, but the empire that rose from the ashes of 1204 was thinner, quieter, and far more fragile than the one that had once crowned emperors and dreamed in marble. Byzantium would live on for another 2 centuries, but the light that had once guided Christendom had flickered, and in the west, beyond the Alps, past ruined aqueducts and fading mosaics, something curious had happened. Rome, though dead in body, had begun to rise again, in name, in ritual, and in memory, not as an empire, but as an idea, a ghost that whispered across kingdoms into cathedrals and courts, shaping the world to come. The eagle no longer flew, the legions no longer marched, the Senate sat only in the imagination of poets, but across the hills and valleys of Europe, in stone churches and candlelit chambers, the name Rome still carried weight. In the Catholic Church, it was not merely remembered, it was inhabited. The Pope, seated beneath the dome of old St. Peter's, spoke not as a bishop of one city, but as heir to a throne older than kings. His robes bore echoes of Caesar's purple. His bulls were written in the same solemn Latin that once echoed through the Senate. His judgments, his rituals, even the shape of his court, bore the quiet imprint of empire. The Latin language, once spoken across continents, had become something stranger, no longer living but never dead. In the villages of France and Spain it fractured into new tongues. In Italy it softened, but in the church and in the minds of scholars, Latin remained pure, timeless. It was the voice of the Mass, the tongue of the Gospels, the language of learning and law. When a priest lifted the host and intoned Hoc est enim corpus meum, "This is my body," he spoke in the voice of centuries. In dusty cloisters and echoing cathedrals, Latin held the world together, not as speech, but as ritual. A spell cast daily to keep time from unraveling. And in the halls of kings and scribes, another ghost lingered. Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis of Justinian, copied, studied, debated, formed the bones of legal systems from Bologna to Bruges. In the West, where blood feuds and tribal customs had once ruled, Roman law offered something different, a sense of order, a vision that laws could be reasoned, not imposed, that justice was not the whim of a lord, but the shape of the world when it was properly aligned. Canon lawyers and royal advisers alike turned to the Roman texts, not only to find rules but to remember what it meant to govern. And so, even as the Roman Empire was dust beneath the sandals of monks and kings, Rome itself had not vanished. It had seeped into the stones of Christendom, into its churches, its libraries, its laws, not as a living thing but as presence, as memory, as legacy, a ghost that stood in the apse at every Mass and whispered in Latin to those still listening. It had been gone for centuries, the old Rome, the true Rome, its legions scattered, its marble halls cracked by time, yet the name endured, like smoke in cathedral light. And for the kings of the north, of Saxony, Swabia, and Franconia, that name still shimmered with power. To be a king was one thing, but to be a Roman emperor, Imperator Romanorum, was to wear the shadow of Caesar. And so, even as Rome lay quiet and broken, its crown was still chaste. The idea took root in 800 CE, when the Frankish king Charlemagne, Karl the Great, knelt in the old Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. The Pope, Leo III, placed a golden crown upon his head and proclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. It was both anointment and gamble. The Byzantine emperors in Constantinople still claimed that title. But Charlemagne's realm, a patchwork of tribes and tongues stretching across modern France and Germany, now bore the prestige of empire. He built palaces at Aachen, studied Latin law, sponsored monks and scholars. He called himself Augustus, invoked Roman titles, styled his rule as the rebirth of order. And though his empire would splinter after his death, the idea endured. For generations afterward, German kings would ride south, not to Jerusalem, not to Byzantium, but to Rome, to be crowned by the Pope as heirs to an empire that no longer existed. This was the birth of the Holy Roman Empire, not Roman in land, nor Roman in language, but Roman in aspiration. It was an empire of oaths and rituals, of pageantry and precedent. The emperor ruled from the north, but his legitimacy flowed through Rome, as if the ancient river of power still trickled through its broken aqueducts. At times, the emperor and pope were allies. At other times, bitter enemies. Some emperors stormed into Italy with armies. Others bowed humbly in snow, begging absolution. The throne was contested, the power fragmented. But always, the name remained. Holy Roman Empire. And across the Alps, peasants who had never seen Rome, who spoke no Latin, still believed their king was emperor by virtue of that city's ghost. Coins bore Latin inscriptions, seals depicted imperial eagles, and in courts and councils the memory of Roman law, of Justinian, of Caesar, of Constantine, was never far. The Holy Roman Empire, like a marble statue covered in moss, stood in the world both ancient and absurd. Voltaire would later mock it as neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. But in its time and in its dreaming, it was something more, a mirror to a vanished world, polished by ritual, crowned in legend, and carried forward by those who refused to let the past lie still. In stone chambers far from cities, tucked into mist-wrapped hills and valleys, the empire lived on, not in marble or armies, but in manuscript and memory. After the Western Roman Empire fell, after the Goths and Vandals, after the emperors vanished and the eagles were brought low, there were still men who wrote, who remembered, who copied. In the quiet halls of monasteries, Roman words passed from hand to hand, quill to parchment, breath to breath, not shouted from the Senate, nor carved on triumphal arches, but whispered, like prayer. The monks, many nameless now, sat bent beneath the light of beeswax candles, wrapped in wool and silence, their fingers stained with ink, their minds trained not to question, but to preserve. They copied Virgil, and Cicero, and Ovid. They wrote out the speeches of statesmen long dead. the verses of poets whose cities no longer stood, the philosophies of pagans in a world now Christian. They did not always understand all they copied, but they sensed the weight of it, the rhythm of the Latin, the architecture of meaning built line by line. In their hands, a civilization's soul was traced, not celebrated, but kept alive. Outside their cloisters, kingdoms rose and fell. Vikings came, castles were built, plagues burned across villages like brushfire. In Rome, popes waged quiet wars. In the east, Byzantium still held its crown. But in the dark, behind walls thick with ivy and thyme, the monks kept Rome's breath alive, not in stone, but in syllable, in the curl of a letter, in the solemn order of words. A world that had ruled by sword now survived by script. And so, when the Renaissance dawned centuries later, when men again read Lucretius and Tacitus and Plato, they read them not from Roman scrolls, but from monastic hands. The memory had survived because a monk, somewhere in fog-covered Britain or a Tuscan hilltop, had not let the page go blank. The Roman Empire had died, but its ghost, warm, flickering, persistent, had endured by candlelight. And so, the banners fall, the legions grow still, the voices of emperors and senators, soldiers and saints, fade into the hush of night. But they do not vanish. They settle into memory, into the soft weight of words, and the long echo of footsteps in forgotten halls. The Roman Empire does not end. It lingers. In every stone road that winds beyond the horizon, in every law written with care, in the silence that follows a cathedral bell. These were not merely histories of conquests and collapse. They were reflections of the soul, of order built in chaos, of dignity held through ruin, of memory outlasting marble. Perhaps, dear listener, you feel it now, that hush, that sense that something very old has passed near. If you are still with us, thank you, truly, for your stillness, your curiosity, your time. In a world that races forward without pause, you chose to drift backward, to walk beneath ruined arches, to hear again the voices buried in Latin, in stone, in the ash of empire. You have journeyed with us from golden triumphs to candlelit manuscripts, across Senate floors, battlefield dust, cathedral domes, and cloistered nights. These stories are not just the past, they are inheritance, and in listening, you have become one of the caretakers. So let us part gently, let the forum grow quiet, let the aqueducts sleep beneath moonlight, and the old gods nod once more into shadow. The names, Augustus, Constantine, Justinian, Alaric, Romulus, they will rest now, but they are not gone. They wait in the rhythm of footsteps on old stones, in the crackle of parchment turned too slowly, in the flicker of a candle left burning on an altar no longer visited. Sleep well now. May your night be free of war horns, and your dreams filled with olive groves, temple columns, and the quiet breath of an empire that still walks among us, unseen, but never quite lost.